Greetings. This is a recording of the slideshow that was developed and prepared and presented by myself, Jennie Joseph, Ayesha Curry Ibrahim, and the late Claudia Booker. I'd like to dedicate this slideshow to Claudia, whose death was a year ago this month, February 2020. And when we created this slideshow and presented this slideshow, it was approximately 8 to 10 years ago. It has been presented in several venues. We would work together and narrate together, but Claudia also presented it by herself. And this is the original slideshow set that was shown at Bastyr University in Washington. I hope you enjoy it. Saving our babies, mothers and families, then and now. Midwives Save Lives, an introduction to the Grand Midwives of the United States of America, a pictorial history of African American midwifery in the United States from the 1600s to the present. We Speak Your Name by Pearl Cleage. Because we are free women, born of free women, who are born of free women, back as far as time begins, we celebrate your freedom. Because we are wise women, born of wise women, who are born of wise women, we celebrate your wisdom. Because we are strong women, born of strong women, who are born of strong women, we celebrate your strength. Because we are magical women, born of magical women, who are born of magical women, we celebrate your magic. The Maafa, which is Kiswahili for Holocaust, is estimated to have involved the kidnapping, sale, and enslavement of between 25 to 100 million humans. The transatlantic slave trade triangle involved the trading of human beings in exchange for raw goods, sugarcane, products such as rum and machinery. From the mid-1400s through the mid-1800s, over 25 million humans from the continent of Africa were kidnapped and transported throughout Europe, the Caribbean, and South, Central, and North America as part of the trafficking of humans called the transatlantic slave trade. From the mid-1400s through the mid-1800s, over 25 million. Using conservative estimates, approximately 10 million humans survived the encapturement and forcible transportation to the New World. The overall impact of the mass kidnapping is set at 100 million Africans. From the mid-1400s to the mid-1800s, over 25 million survived the encapturement and forcible transportation to the New World. The overall impact of the mass kidnapping set at 100 million. And millions of women of childbearing age were kidnapped and sold into perpetual captivity. Their children were sold at a moment's notice. Among these women were traditional midwives and healers. For over 250 years, these midwives and the generations of African-American midwives that came after them were tasked with not only providing antenatal and postpartum care to their community of women, but also to the wives, sisters, friends, and associates of those who now owned them and their children. These midwives and healers were the sole healthcare providers for every member of their community, regardless of age or gender. They were able, with the help of the indigenous peoples they met, to learn how to use the medicinal herbs in this new world. These African midwives and the generations of African-American midwives that came after them have saved the lives of countless mothers and babies throughout the Americas, and particularly in the United States. They were the elder women, the wise women. As of 1808, when Congress officially ended the nation's overt participation in the international slave trade, the only practical way of increasing the number of enslaved laborers was through new births. Women's childbearing capacity became a commodity that could be traded on the open market. If enslaved mothers did not bear sufficient numbers of children to take the place of aged and dying workers, the South could not continue as a slave society. This important aspect of slavery has been all too often ignored. Slaveholders expected to appropriate and exploit the reproductive lives of enslaved women. Control of one's body was not a fundamental right of these enslaved women. Emboldened by law and custom to do with human chattels as they wished, slave owners felt entitled to intervene in even the most intimate of matters. Women entering their childbearing years, especially those who had proven their fertility through the birth of a baby, sold easily and for a high price. Former slave records show that a girl of 15 who had no children sold for $800, but a breeding woman sold for $1,500. In addition to the African women being used as chattel for labor and for breeding purposes, they were used for scientific experiments by now renowned American doctors. J. Marion Sims is called the father of gynecology due to his experiments on enslaved women in Alabama, who were often submitted as guinea pigs by their plantation owners when they could no longer be used for their reproductive or human capital or for sexual pleasure. Under the authority of the local plantation masters, Sims performed hysterectomies, tubal ligations, and other procedures to examine various female disorders on women who had no say in the decision-making process that led up to their surgeries. He used opium to render them addicted and immobile. Sims believed that Africans were numb to pain and operated on many women without anesthetic or antiseptic. A detailed history of this monster is in Harriet Washington's book, Medical Apartheid. Sims is famous for his work and his invention of many obstetric implements still in use today, such as Sims forceps, Sims speculum, and so on. When we prepared this slideshow, Sims' statue still stood in New York Central Park, but has since been removed. The legacy of the transatlantic slave trade and slavery in the Americas continues today. The development of the slave doctrine that Africans and their progeny were less than humans continue to dramatically adversely impact today's perception of Africans and African Americans. This legacy still continues to create disadvantages for Africans throughout the diaspora and globally. Let us now share with you some of the African American midwives and their stories. Many were born into slavery. Some gained their freedom, either through escape or manumission. Others were midwives during and after slavery, and after slavery was officially abolished in the United States, though they continued to serve the same populations of poor and perpetually indentured families, regardless of their race or status. Many of these midwives had been identified when they were entering puberty by the elder women of the community or by an elder midwife to begin the lifelong apprenticeship process of becoming a holistic community-based midwife. They perfected knowledge of pharmacology through the use of herbs and food-based medicines, gynecology, obstetrics, anatomy and physiology through hands-on study, nutrition and diet, peer review through the sharing of birth stories with other midwives, and psychosocial and family counseling through their role as honored women in their respective communities. Their remedies were herbal, Castor oil and catnip teas to soothe their patients and encourage birth. Camphor and turpentine were also used. These beautiful ladies were not only midwives, they were also spiritual healers and respected by the elders and the community. 4 midwives of Virginia. Rain, snow, night or day, by foot or wagon, the communities of Alexander County, Virginia, could always depend on these midwives. They were Mittie Dula, Josie King, Martha McLean, and Cynthia Harriet Alexander. Cynthia Harriet Alexander was born in 1850. Mrs. Alexander delivered all over Taylorsville. The transportation she used was a horse and wagon. Mrs. Millie Dula delivered babies in Bethlehem, Ellendale, and around Alexander County area. Most of the babies she delivered were white, although she delivered her own family members too. She died in the year 1943. Mrs. Josie King delivered babies in the Rocky Face area. Her form of transportation was walking. Mrs. King died at the age of 79 from a stroke, and she had 1 child. Mrs. Martha McLean delivered babies in the Stony Point area. She was also a missionary worker. She was born in 1867 and died in 1950. Thank God for all of the African-American midwives in Alexandria and around the world who not only saved African-American lives, but white as well, because the love they had was colorblind. Bridget Biddy Mason was born into slavery in Mississippi on August 15, 1818. Biddy Mason became a pioneer in Los Angeles' earliest African-American business and religious communities. Miss Mason worked as a nurse and a midwife, saving $300,000, which she used to fund the first African Methodist Episcopal Church in Los Angeles. Though she passed away in 1891 in an unmarked grave, her impact on the city remains a century later. On March 27, 1988, 3,000 members of the First AME Church were present, including Mayor Tom Bradley, as her tombstone was unveiled at the Evergreen Cemetery in Boyle Heights. Mason is a legendary figure in the church and the historic African-American community in Los Angeles. She's commemorated annually on November 16th, Biddy Mason Day, as well as through a monument at the Biddy Mason Park at 330 South Spring Street, just doors away from her first property. Miss Pearl Finley Henry was a midwife and the only one for a while in her area. She delivered at least 90% of the babies throughout the vicinity, from the Yellow River to the Alabama-Florida line. She always wore a white sheer apron. It had a corner tied in a knot where she kept a few dollars or coins. All the children in the community would be happy to see her coming to hear about her journey. There were times she would leave home to deliver a baby and not return until weeks later. And when she did return home, sometimes her pay would be a live pig or chicken, a ham, eggs, or a piece of material if she was blessed. Old Sibby Kelly. Midwives were deeply entrenched in their communities, especially those located in the slave states. They, like the communities that they served, sought life without enslavement and joined in the struggle for freedom. They began migrating to the freed states, Canada, and the West. By the mid-1800s, there were African-American midwives throughout the United States. By the end of the Civil War and with the signing of the Emancipation Proclamation, the plantation system began to disintegrate. However, the now freed African Americans entered a new system of perpetual indentured servitude. This new system would soon be reinforced by Reconstruction, Jim Crow laws, and the rise of the Ku Klux Klan. Old Sibby Kelly, a former slave and one of the last midwives in Petersville, Georgia. Those hands caught many a baby. She lived until 1934, and her spirit continues to live. Miss Amalie Weaver Roberts. For generations, midwives continued to serve their communities as well as other families, regardless of race or economic status. Miss Amalie was a midwife who was born a midwife as was her mother before her, in slavery and in freedom. She was famous for healthy deliveries and healthy mothers who never died of childbed fever. Maria Scales Watkins was born about 1824. During the Civil War, she served as a nurse and was known to have kept very high standards in her profession. When a baby's birth was imminent, someone would send for Aunt Maria. She arrived promptly, always carrying her African-American doctor bag. She was always dressed in an African-American dress and hat with an immaculate white apron of crocheted lace tied around her waist. Maria was highly respected as a very efficient midwife for 2 generations in Newton County. She is believed to have delivered more than 500 babies in Neosho. Her 2 most famous babies were the artist Thomas Hart Benton and scientist George Washington Carver. Her influence in the life of George Washington Carver is well known. Carver came to Kansas to live with Aunt Maria. She taught him homemaking skills of washing, ironing, and cooking. He used these skills to earn food and lodging while he struggled for an education. Aunt Ellen Lewis was known as the best midwife for miles around. She practiced her trade for more than 50 years, delivering babies for all of Wolfe County, Kentucky, and most of its surrounding counties. According to her family, she had no formal training. It was a gift. However, she was a licensed midwife. This made little difference to most people when a younger midwife with formal training came to the area. It's been told the younger woman soon moved on when she learned that she was no competition for Aunt Ellen in the eyes of the community. Midwife Sybil Harper. As with the community they served, the midwives migrated from the plantation and farms of the South to other parts of the United States, either as a result of getting their freedom or escaping. Some went on the westward expansion travels in the 1850s and after the Civil War. Midwife Sybil was a prominent midwife in Oregon during the late 19th century. She was also the mother of cowboy Bert Harper. According to the obituary published in the Wyoming Star, when Aunt Nancy Phillips died in 1904, she had been born into slavery in 1834. The reporter remarked, "Many a kind act has been performed by the kind hands of Auntie during her long residence in Green River, where residents often looked upon her advice as they would that of their family physician." Nancy was a midwife in remote towns in Wyoming and had been born into slavery in 1834. The 1900s and the Great Migration. With the lack of opportunity in the Jim Crow laws as the new configuration of segregation and racism, African Americans began the trek to the northern industrial cities, looking for work, education, housing, and more opportunity. They settled in cities where members of their families and former Southern communities settled. With them came the midwives to serve them. The midwives in their new homes became an integral part of the community and not visible to outsiders. Though few in number, they became community-based midwives, elder women for their newly located communities. However, with the rapid expansion of hospitals, those segregated and many providing poor quality services to African Americans, the new arrivals began to rely on the growing market of hospital-based obstetric care. Meharry Medical School. In segregated America, no one took responsibility for the delivery of care to African Americans. Through considerable struggle, African American medical professionals began taking charge of care for African Americans. But this transformation was difficult. In the early 1900s, African Americans were restricted from mainstream professional medical societies, as well as most medical schools. In fact, in 1900, only 7 medical schools were training African Americans at all. For both African Americans and Mexican Americans, public health and other medical societies did not begin taking responsibility for their health until they were deemed a threat to the health of whites. Thus, the type of care delivered was generally in the form of hygiene control and treatment of infectious diseases. A 1910 report, the Flexner Report, was done to determine the efficacy and necessity of medical schools. and led to the closing of African American medical schools that had opened their doors to female and African American students, finding them to be unnecessary. Within 4 years of the Flexner report, 4 of the 6 medical schools had closed, leaving only Howard University and Meharry Medical School. As a result, if African American individuals were to receive medical care, it was likely to come from a white health professional or a grand midwife. A limited number of African American health professionals were practicing at the time. Midwifery regulation targeted the African American grand midwives. However, as these midwives were pushed out of the profession, many disenfranchised African American communities were left without any culturally competent resources. A limited number of Black health professionals were practicing at the time midwifery regulation targeted African American grand midwives. In the first half of the 20th century, American midwifery did not disappear. It was racialized. As white American-born women increasingly turned away from performing or selecting midwife deliveries, the change in racial demographics of midwifery made it vulnerable to criticism. At the turn of the century, with the American Medical Association's systematic campaign against midwives in full swing and the Shepard-Towner Act in place, states began enacting statutes to limit or prohibit midwives from practicing, and many of those laws remain in place today. Those statutes, coupled with more recent legislation, have left non-nurse midwives severely limited in how and where they may practice in the United States. Midwifery regulation targeted African American grand midwives. As a result, as these midwives were pushed out of the profession, many disenfranchised African American communities were left without any culturally competent resources. In 1921, Congress passed the Shepard-Towner Act, sometimes called the Maternity Act, to reduce maternal and infant mortality through grants that encouraged states to establish formal relationships between public health nurses and midwives working in rural and underserved communities, thereby incentivizing all but 10 states to pass restrictive midwifery laws by tying funds for midwifery education to the implementation of midwifery. This legislation was supported by progressives, social reformers, and feminists. At the time the legislation was introduced, childbirth remained the second leading cause of death for women. At the beginning of the 20th century, for every 1,000 live births, 6 to 9 women in the United States died of pregnancy-related complications, and approximately 100 infants died before their first year. About 20% of all children in the United States died in their first year, and about 33% in their first 5 years of life. The campaign ignored data that showed immigrant and African American midwives provided good care. Statistics available in the 1920s and 1930s demonstrated significantly better outcomes in terms of maternal mortality among populations of women attended by both African American and immigrant midwives than the statistics from populations attended by physician providers. Family income was an important factor in these mortality rates, and the Shepard-Towner Act was designed to encourage states to develop programs to serve women at lower income levels. However, the campaign ignored data that showed immigrant and African American midwives provided good care, resulting in well-documented statistics that demonstrated significantly better outcomes for the populations of women attended by African American midwives. The Shepard-Towner Act provided for federal matching funds for such programs as health clinics for women and children, hiring physicians and nurses to educate and care for pregnant women and mothers and their children, and visiting nurses to educate and care for pregnant and new mothers. Midwife training and distribution of nutrition and hygiene information, all these areas that midwives had been managing already. Between 1922 and 1929, the Children's Bureau conducted 183,252 conferences, established 2,978 prenatal care units, visiting nurses made over 3 million home visits, and more than 22 million pamphlets had been passed out. America's infant and maternal death rates fell by 16% and 12% respectively, but these were still twice what New Zealand and Great Britain experienced in the same years. Let's look at some more midwives. Aunt Sally and Mama Lou. In 1923, an estimated 60,000 midwives were practicing throughout the United States. By 1932, roughly 80% of midwives still practicing were in the rural South. The impact of the act, which came on the heels of American women winning the right to vote in 1920, was to decimate African American midwifery for the rest of the century. African American midwives continued to do what they had done historically, answer the call to serve their communities, particularly when no one else had shown any prior interest in doing so. With little resources or no medical support, they gave years of service, often delivering thousands of babies in a lifetime. The impact of the act, which came on the heels of American women winning the right to vote, decimated African American midwifery. Congress allowed the act's funding to lapse in 1929 after successful opposition by the American Medical Association, which saw the act as a socialist threat to its professional autonomy. The campaign to eliminate African American midwives was being waged by both obstetricians and public health nurses aspiring to establish a specialty in midwifery. In addition, medical, public health, and nursing journals published articles accusing immigrant and African American midwives of being ignorant, dirty, and dangerous. These descriptors were believed as fact, widely used during this campaign, and appeared in print as late as the 1980s. Midwives Mary Moss Simmons, Larina Green, and Lizzie Perkins. For over 3 centuries, African American midwives had delivered babies and practiced folk medicine in rural counties throughout the South, serving women regardless of their race or economic status. Yet during the next 2 decades, reformers campaigned unsuccessfully to totally eliminate the practice of midwifery. Training midwives was deemed the only viable solution in the South, where African American midwives were predominant. Midwives received instruction from public health nurses during an annual state-sponsored institutes and monthly local midwives clubs. Classes which emphasized sanitary delivery practices were taught by demonstration, songs, and role-playing. From the 1920s through the 1960s, this next generation of midwives continued in the tradition of their grand predecessors with the added benefit of scientific knowledge. The public health nurses reached out to grand midwives and, at least in some locations, met with them monthly to discuss problems arising from recent births and to give instructions on basic maternity care. The midwives traveled long distances to attend these trainings. The midwives were so eager to train and appease the state-sponsored nurses, but did not realize they themselves were the midwife problem, and that the training they were receiving would precede the end of their profession. The regulation of the midwives generally conformed to a 3-phase plan of education, licensing, and elimination. These plans differed from state to state, but in most instances, essential midwives, those who served communities that were rural and inaccessible or distasteful in their poverty and inability to pay for medical services, received training from public health officials. After relationships were cultivated and developed between health departments, midwives, and their patients, licensing requirements were instituted. Those regulations generally required some period of training and/or partnerships with physicians or health professionals. Eventually, the licensing would be restricted or phased out when doctors could find a market within the midwives' communities, leaving the midwives with no legally protected practice and effectively no clientele. One of the program's aims was the eventual total removal of the midwives from the practice of prenatal care and newborn delivery altogether. The midwives bag tag. This tag was given to students in the midwife program. The tag listed the necessary items that they should always have in their professional bags, including sharpened razors, sanitary solution, linens, and bandages. The tag concluded with the advice that the safe midwife keeps her bag clean and ready at all times. This is an unissued copy of the certificate issued by the State Board of Health awarding discharge to midwives. This certificate illustrates the need to honor midwives, who are often highly regarded members of their own communities, while ushering them out of an increasingly professionalized and centrally organized sector of medical care. In 1931, Florida's first midwifery law was passed, requiring midwives to attend 15 births with a licensed registered physician in order to receive the certification necessary to continue practicing. In 1933, it was estimated that at least 1/3 of the state's births were midwife attended. In an effort to locate the 1,400 midwives thought to be practicing in the state, a letter was sent with a voluntary response rate nearing 50%. The response serves as evidence of the midwives' belief that the newfound state interest in the practice of midwifery was a positive one. This is an unissued copy of the certificate issued by the state of Florida, awarding discharge to midwives. Louisiana midwife Julia Marguerite Mills Shade was a medical innovator and forerunner. For years before it became conventional wisdom, she recognized the relationship between the health of the mother and healthy newborns, and was in fact an early and adamant proponent of prenatal care. No drinking, no smoking, she explained in her advice to expecting mothers in an interview. And we grew our own medicines back then, catnip, peppermint, all the old time things. In 48 years of work, Shade never lost a mother or a child, and her daughter still has photo albums loaded with scores of baby pictures of the children her mother delivered, as well as copies of every birth certificate her mother filled out, beginning in 1943 until her retirement in 1983. The Tuskegee School of Nursing was held at the Tuskegee Normal School for Nurses, as it was first called, and was established in September 1892 to educate young African-American women who wanted to learn the art of caring for the sick. It began as a 2-year program established by the university's founder and first president, Dr. Booker T. Washington. The nursing school expanded rapidly, adding a 3-year program in 1908 and becoming approved and registered by the Alabama State Board of Nurse Examiners in 1928. In 1941, the school continued its pioneering tradition by creating the nation's first predominantly African-American nurse practitioner program in nurse midwifery education. Yet a total of only 25 midwives were graduated over a 5-year period. The era of the professional midwife had arrived for some African Americans. Public health nurse McGreen is seen here weighing an infant in 1944 and with another woman holding a baby during the West Florida Midwives Institute at Florida A&M College, FAMU, in Tallahassee, Florida in around 1933. Mrs. Mamie Odessa Hale was a nurse midwife who worked in the Crittenden County Health Department in 1942. On July the 1st, 1945, Ms. Hale was appointed to the position of midwife consultant for the Arkansas Department of Health with the responsibility to train the midwives. The classes proved challenging because at least 75% of the midwives were illiterate and only 5% could satisfactorily complete a birth certificate. Ms. Hale used innovative methods such as songs, movies, pictures, and demonstrations with a 30-pound mannequin to teach the appropriate techniques for managing prenatal care, preparing for the delivery, performing aftercare, completing a birth certificate, and seeking medical supervision. Midwives who attended all lectures and met state requirements received permits at graduation ceremonies. Midwives were expected to undergo a medical examination, complete a pledge card, possess a midwife bag equipped according to the instructions of the state health department, and complete an application for a midwife permit. A graduation ceremony was held at which graduates would recite a pledge stating that they would complete a birth certificate for every child and obey all regulations. In 1943, there were an estimated 1,565 midwives practicing in the state. 6 years later, that number would drop to just 1,000 midwives with permits who attended 5,026 births, 17% of the state's infants born that year. Nurse midwife Mamie Hale. Mamie Hale attended the Tuskegee School of Nurse Midwifery for Colored Nurses in Alabama in 1941. Arkansas's maternal infant mortality statistics during the 1940s emphasized the racial discrepancies between white and African American women. The infant mortality rate for white infants was relatively stable at 44 per thousand live births in 1939 and 43 in 1940. The rate for African American infants was 73 for both years per thousand. By 1944, the maternal mortality rate for African American women was 2.5 times as high as it was for white women in the same year. In the 1940s, midwife births were common, as less than 25% of births in Arkansas occurred in hospitals. During World War II, the state suffered a loss of physicians and nurses to the war effort, leaving African American and white women to rely heavily on the grand midwives. After the war, African American women continued to be delivered primarily by grand midwives who attended almost 75% of all of the African American births. Midwife Maud Cullen was born in Quincy, Florida in 1898. She was educated at Florida A&M and took a nursing course before moving to Berkeley County as a nurse and midwife in 1923. She was sponsored by the Episcopal Church, and Cullen spent 13 years as a nurse and midwife in the Pineville area before joining the Berkeley County Health Department. Her work, which included the training of hundreds of midwives, took her to all parts of Berkeley County. Please note this photo depicts the conditions that many African American people lived in 1951 and still to today. Midwife Miss Mary Frances Coley was born in Georgia and delivered over 3,000 babies in the middle part of the 20th century. With little, if any, formal schooling, she became an accomplished and recognized midwife, an advocate for healthcare who saw no racial barriers, and was documented in the award-winning film, All My Babies. In 1953, this film was produced by the Georgia Department of Public Health, which was used to educate midwives in the southern states of United States of America. In 2002, this film was selected for preservation in the United States National Film Registry by the Library of Congress as being culturally, historically, and aesthetically significant. Although states and institutions continue to train midwives, the 1950s brought the massive propaganda for women to rely on the new medical field of obstetrics and the increasing number of hospitals, and the message that birth as a medical condition could best be managed by doctors in a hospital. And of course, its accompanying message that breastfeeding was crude. These are images courtesy of the Florida Department of State and the Division of Library and Information Services. Miss Margaret Charles Smith attended over 3,500 home births in Greene County, Alabama, in the midst of Jim Crow, the Ku Klux Klan, and the Civil Rights Movement. Once there were thousands of licensed grand midwives throughout the South, now there are none. Who are they? Who were they? Where did they go? Because of segregation, many Americans knew nothing about natural home birth with experienced grands like Margaret Charles Smith, who learned from each other and could deal with breech deliveries, multiple births, and other situations with no medical instruments or drugs. Miss Margaret's mother tells of saving a 1.5-pound baby by making an incubator out of a cardboard box and hot water bottles. Miss Margaret successfully attended over 3,500 births without a single maternal death, worked a farm like a man, and triumphed over the adversities of Jim Crow, poverty, lack of education, and the slavery of sharecropping. I've been through the ringer, she says, of living in Greene County, Alabama, a Ku Klux Klan stronghold, where, according to Ralph Abernathy, racism was so entrenched that winning the right to vote there was more historic than man's walk on the moon. As the home birth movement of the 60s and 70s took hold, the remaining grand midwives leaned heavily on the public health nurses, turning to them to help decipher newly developing legal requirements and rules. Bringing in the Spirit is a film history of African-American midwives. They told the story in this film of two intertwining pathways along which the African-American midwives are traveling, with their goals yet to be reached. The 1950s and the 1970s. The 1950s brought the massive propaganda for women to rely on the new medical field of obstetrics. And the 1970s was when the 1950s brought the massive propaganda for women to rely on the new medical field of obstetrics and the increasing number of hospitals, and the message that birth was best managed by doctors in a hospital. These arrivals of the Great Migration wanted the perceived advantages of the North, which included hospital births and not the home birth and midwifery model that was the only option they had had in the South. Like other new arrivals, they wanted all parts of the new dream of the North, and many relinquished the practices of the past that were tainted with memories of racism, poverty, and lack of options. However, the community-based African-American midwives, as with other midwives from immigrant communities, continue to serve unnoticed by the larger society and protected by their own communities in the South. From 1959 to 1976, Grand Midwife Gladys Milton delivered babies and provided postpartum services in the homes of her clients in Walton County, Florida. She also sought additional aid for these women from social programs or donations from church and civic groups. Then in 1976, Gladys established Walton County's first birthing center, a facility now known as Milton Memorial Birthing Center. The goal of the historic Milton Memorial Birth Center was to provide a safe, family-oriented environment for low-risk women who could not afford the cost of hospital care. However, many women chose Milton Memorial Birthing Center because the style of services was based on the midwifery model of care. In addition to being a midwife, Gladys Milton was a community activist. She was a strong advocate of the preservation of history and the promotion of literacy. For years, she worked towards establishing a library and museum in the northern part of Walton County. On the day before she passed away, Gladys petitioned the Walton County, Florida Board of Commissioners to make the library a reality. Although she did not live to see it, a library is now opened in North Walton County. Located in Flowers View, Florida, the library is named the Gladys N. Milton Memorial Library in her honor. You can learn more about midwife Gladys Milton and her work from the numerous newspaper articles television broadcasts, documentary films, and 2 autobiographies. Over a 40-year period, she delivered 3,000 babies. Gladys Milton delivered 3,000 babies, and during her notable career, her work as a midwife led her to being inducted into the Florida Women's Hall of Fame in 1994, and posthumously into Okaloosa County, Florida Women's Hall of Fame in 2001. The legacy of her work continues at Milton Memorial Birthing Center through her daughter and fellow midwife, Maria Milton. With the 1970s movement for Black empowerment and self-determination, young African-American women began to follow in the footsteps of the earlier midwives and began the journey to become midwives themselves with the vision of serving the women of their communities. Some were fortunate enough to study at the feet of the elder midwives still in their communities. Others decided to study and learn among themselves through a combination of formal education and the apprenticeship hands-on model. Many were welcomed by the midwives at the farm for training workshops, and a relationship between the African-American midwives and the farm midwives began to blossom. Here, Sondra Abdullah Zaima Salama was pictured with Anna Mae Gaskin at the farm around 1980. The African-American midwives at the end of the 20th century. There were many organizations that began, and pictured here are the founder, Ayana Ade, flanked by 2 of the original members of the Childbirth Providers of African Descent, or CPAD. Again, Salama, Sondra Abdullah Zaima, and Makeda Kamara. These 3 women founded the Childbirth Providers of African Descent. And today, these women are certified nurse midwives who continue to practice the art and tradition of midwifery, both stateside and abroad. Sadly, Sister Ayana Ade has passed. The African-American Midwifery Organization of the 1990s. The Childbirth Providers of African Descent was an organization founded by Ayana Ade, who has since deceased, Sondra Abdullah Zaima, and Makeda Kamara. African-American midwifery organizations were founded in the 1990s. Pictured here are some of the founding members of the African-American Association, the Childbirth Providers of African Descent, or CPAD. Sister Ayana Ade has since passed, but she's flanked by Salama, Abdullah Zaima, and Makeda Kamara, women who continue to practice the art and tradition of midwifery even to today. CPAD was formed in 1976 and was the first national organization of African-American midwives. These African-American midwives published an annual newsletter. They gathered together yearly for skill building and hosted an international conference in Jamaica before the organization ceased in 1984. The International Center for Traditional Childbearing, ICTC, was a nonprofit African-centered international organization of midwives, healers, and doulas located in Portland, Oregon. On August 31st, 1991, Shafia M. Monroe, midwife and founder, formed the organization in consensus with a national group of midwives and educators. ICTC was created to improve the health of women and their families, improve maternal outcomes, reduce infant mortality, and encourage breastfeeding. In addition, it provides recruitment, education, and support to African American women aspiring to become midwives and to those desiring to serve their community through community workshops, study groups, or just one-on-one support. We are determined that the early death of babies and mothers, an aftermath of slavery, and a legacy of poverty shall be reversed, as was quoted. These pictures are from the early 90s, times when we would gather at ICTC meetings, at conferences. And so we got to the African Americans of the 21st century. We are everywhere, pursuing all routes to midwifery. Certified nurse midwives, certified professional midwives, PEP prepared apprentice trained midwives, and the Midwives Education Accreditation Council, which now accredits midwifery training programs, and of course, traditional midwives. We serve all communities via hospitals, clinics, birth centers, home birth, and home visits. We own our own clinics and birth centers. We have our own organizations, national organizations, and the now closed National Organization of Birth Centers and Clinics of Color. But we also own our own schools and training sites. Common Sense Childbirth School of Midwifery was founded in 2009. ICTC Full Circle Doula training is continued by Shafia Monroe and Shafia Monroe Consulting. Darren A. Blunt at the Birth Roots Babies in San Diego, Resha Tani Lohala at Community Birth Center in California, and so on. At the time of making these slides and sharing this presentation, these were our early beginning organizations and groups and programs that were blossoming within the African American midwifery community. Many of these midwives are still in practice. Many of our elders are still in community, are available, are open and willing to support and mentor, are all on the same journey towards empowering and supporting the growth of midwifery. We are here because you taught us that sister speak can continue to be our native tongue, no matter how many languages we learn as we move about as citizens of the world and of the ever-evolving universe. The hands of African American midwives have always saved lives. We are here to speak your names because of the way you made for us, because of the prayers you prayed for us. We are the ones you conjured up, hoping we would have strength enough and discipline enough and talent enough and nerve enough to step into the light when it turned in our direction and just smile a while. We are the ones you hoped would make you, we hoped would make you proud because of all your hard work, which makes all of ours part of something better, truer, deeper, something that lights the way ahead like a lamp unto our feet, as steady as the unforgettable beat of our collective heart. We speak your name. We speak your name. We speak your name. Many of these resources are now old or hard to find, but are out there. I encourage you to do your own research, check some of the links, go through Google, do what you need to do to understand the amazing legacy that is the history of the African American midwife in the United States. Thank you.